Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Eric Kramer. Eric is the author of Active Interviewing, Branding, Selling, and Presenting Yourself to Win Your Next Job. Eric has a background in the corporate world and psychological counseling that has led to extensive experience in career development and job transition coaching, and he has written several award-winning books for the career field. His latest book, Active Interviewing, provides new information every job seeker needs to know to win interviews and land jobs in today's rapidly changing and hyper-competitive job market. Eric, welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Howard, thank you. Thanks for hosting me. I'm excited about being here.
Fantastic. I have to say the launch of this new book, Active Interviewing, and all the things that we are going through today out in the job market with COVID-19, the timing was either really good or, I should have waited or I should have done something different. But, we're just so much turmoil these days in out in the job market. And, active interviewing is just such an important topic. So before we actually get into the book, I wonder if you could share with our listeners a little bit more background than I provided in the introduction about, your experience and your work.
Well, I have one of these multifactorial type of careers. I started my career as a clinical psychologist and spent a number of years doing clinical work. I was a psychologist in a psychiatric hospital. And I had a private practice. And I transitioned from that into working for Blue Cross, the insurance company, helping them to put together a mental health and substance abuse managed care program. And that's when I kind of divulged and went off more towards the corporate world and ended up having my own software development company. I did some work for a market research company for a while. But then somewhere along the way, I decided I really wanted to get back more to my counseling clinical type of work. And I was actually introduced to a large transition company, a job transition company, by a friend of mine. And I got a job working as a full-time consultant for one of the world's largest transition companies. And that really started my career. And I've been doing transition work, career management, career development, helping people find jobs for the last probably about 15, 16 years.
That is indeed a career. And I'm curious, does your clinical training, does that inform much of the career development, career transition coaching, job transition coaching that you're doing? And are there elements that, it was really useful to have this clinical background?
Yeah, I think the clinical background has been terrific. There's so much emotion that's wrapped up in people's careers. And certainly when people go into job search, it's such an emotionally challenging activity with lots of highs and lots of lows. Disappointments, excitements, frustrations. So being able to work with people through those feelings and understanding what the dynamics are of those emotions has been very helpful. In addition, I've used my psychological knowledge to inform job interviewing, and some of the strategies and techniques I've come up with for job interviews is based on psychological concepts.
When I was going through the job interview years ago, because I really haven't had to interview for many jobs. And I know these days people go from job to job and there's just a lot of interviewing techniques out there and experiences. But I always remember, you had to go in with specific questions and there was a lot of guidance on what to wear. And it's something I still do today. I do some transition coaching, or I used to back in Chicago where I lived, and I'd get this weak handshake from somebody and it just gnawed at me. And then, always have to have positivity, the smile, the eye contact. And how has that now evolved, in terms of these techniques that you're now sharing with your clients in this active interviewing construct that you've created?
It's actually because of the things that you're talking about that I came out with active interviewing. One of the things I was disappointed with was all the advice that's out there. And there's literally millions of websites that you can go to. And they all have a smattering of information about job interviews and how to interview for jobs. But a lot of them talk about exactly what you brought up, Howard. They're talking about a good handshake and good eye contact and good body language and being positive. And these are all very basic interview strategies for people that they need to know, but it's nowhere near enough to differentiate somebody and really impress an interviewer. So it's like if you have a strong handshake, you don't get the job. But if you have a weak handshake, you lose the job. It's really not enough. And what I did with active interviewing is I've developed strategies that are much more advanced and much more impactful than just the run-of-the-mill, been there, done that type of suggestions that most people get.
And so with the strategies that you have developed, and I would imagine these have evolved for you over the years, and maybe they have what you started with, or these ideas that you started with, the 2020 version may be different than the 2016 version. But can you share what these strategies are and how you work with your clients to put these into practice to help them succeed in their interview?
Yeah. Well, maybe the best place to start is why I thought that this was necessary to come out with an interview strategy. And by the way, what's interesting to me is that there is, other than active interviewing, there is no interview strategy, one comprehensive interview strategy. So for example, if I were to say to you, Howard, you're going for an interview next week, what interview strategy are you using? Well, there isn't one. So you would say, well, I've read a lot of, different books, or I've read a lot of different websites, and I'm going to be sure to answer questions, and I'm going to, handshakes and all that stuff. But when a person has active interviews, they can say, well, next week when I'm going to my interview, I'm going to use an active interviewing strategy. So they have a comprehensive approach that they can use, from the preparation to actually strategies they can use within the interview to actually following through after the interview. And the reason I started this is that many years ago, I was working for an outplacement company, and I was working with literally hundreds of candidates in job transition. And we were doing, and this is even back in the early 2000s, we were doing very sophisticated training. We had video cameras, and we would videotape people doing interviews, and we would do mock interviews, and we'd do lectures and all that type of thing. But even with all that training, I was finding that people would go into the interviews and they come out and I say, well, how'd it go? And they say, oh, it went lousy. And there were two primary reasons. The first reason was that the candidate themselves, when they got to the interview, was so nervous and so anxious, they really forgot to use the things that we had trained and taught them. It all went out the window. And then the second part would be that the interviewer was terrible. So the candidate would say, well, I didn't get a word in edgewise. All the interviewer did was talk about themselves. They went on about themselves and the job. And when I got up and left, they didn't know anything about me. And I said, well, why did you let them do that? And they said, well, what can I do? It's their interview, and I'm supposed to be there answering questions, but they didn't ask me any questions. What came to my mind is that the candidate really needs to be active in the interview. So what I did is I took the interview and I saw it as a sales process, which I think is a good model for entire job search. A job search is really a sales process in that a candidate is selling their services to a prospect, which is, a company, to a prospective customer. And then, of course, the interview is the last step, which is the sales call, where the candidate goes in face to face to be able to sell their services to the interviewer. Well, taking that sales paradigm, the next step was that people, number one, need to prepare adequately to make sure that they know all they need to know to be able to present themselves well. And then the next step, like any salesperson, a candidate needs to have a sales presentation they bring with them into the interview, and then use that sales presentation to communicate to the interviewer what the candidate wants the interviewer to know about them, so they can differentiate themselves, impress the interviewer, and then get the job.
Eric, what does the sales presentation look like? If I am on the receiving end, so I have an interviewee coming in, he or she, it has this presentation. What does that look like?
Well, what it looks like when you're face to face with somebody is it's a presentation deck, and it's the same now that people are doing it over Zoom. That you send the deck to somebody before the interview. But the way it works is that the candidate walks into the interview, and the first thing they say is, I'm really interested and excited about this job. And I put together a presentation about my background and experience, and how it matches the critical requirements of the job and why I think I'm an excellent candidate. If we have time in the interview, I'd love to share that with you. And then they just put the presentation down on the table. So in this way, it gives the interviewer still has complete control of the interview, but yet the interviewer often, I would say probably 99% of the time, is so intrigued by, hey, what is this thing? What is this presentation that this candidate has brought in, that they take a look at the presentation. And even though it's a presentation, it's really not. What it really is designed to do is to create a conversation in the interview. And the best interview is a conversation rather than a question and answer period.
When the candidate goes into for the interview with the hiring manager or the HR, whoever it might be, brings this presentation. I know in PowerPoints, I've seen PowerPoints that were like eye charts. There was just so much data pressed into it. You couldn't even begin to read it. And then we went the opposite end where we have a picture, maybe a bullet or two. And is there somewhere in the middle that your clients are going to be bringing to that interview? And how do we then also talk about our stories, where, the challenges we faced, the actions we took, and the results?
That's how the interview presentation is really designed. Your point is a good one, that when people are asked to put together their own presentations, they do write paragraphs. This presentation is designed with bullet points, and no bullet point is more than 170 characters. The idea is to present the bullet point and then speak to it, and then also have stories to tell. So the way the presentation runs is the first page is a cover page. It has, a graphic on it. It also has 4 personal brand terms. So a candidate picks 4 words or phrases that they want to represent their brand. It could be analytical, problem solver, mastermind, all sorts of astute. There's all sorts of words they can pick to communicate a brand. So it starts right away where they're getting their brand across. Then the next page is what the candidate believes to be the critical job requirements. So it's a list of the requirements. And what they say when they turn to that page is, here's what I believe to be the critical job requires for this position. I'd love to discuss them with you just to make sure that I understand the critical requirements as you see them. The number 2 reason that a person fails in a job is that they take the job thinking it's one thing and it actually turns out to be something else. The number 1 reason a person fails in a job is they take a job and they just don't have the skill set to do it. They're chosen inappropriately. But by being able to talk about the job requirements, 2 things happen. One is that there's a greater understanding of what the job entails. So the candidate, when they are thinking about taking the job, they know what it's about. But also the candidate knows a lot more about the job, so they can speak in more detail during the interview to the requirements of the job as that interviewer sees them. Then the next page or several pages have to do with how the candidate matches the critical requirements of the job. You're looking for this, I've done these things. Then the next section is how that candidate is differentiated, what additional areas of expertise they bring to the table. It could be that a person is going for a legal position and they do in tax law, but they've done criminal law. So that's a nice addition. It could be that a person is going to manage a factory, but they've been involved with constructing factories. So they can help the company build new additions or reconfigure the factory if necessary. So that's an area of differentiation. The next one is some success stories, as you were talking about. So it's like, here where I've been successful in my career, let me tell you about them. Then the next section is soft skills that they bring to the table that makes them good at the work they do. So these are what's called personal success factors. And what they do is they have examples of how they use their personal success factors, how they use their soft skills to be successful in jobs. Next section is a 30 and 60-day strategic action plan. So this is really kind of a mini business plan. When you hire me, here's what my goals are for the first 30 and 60 or 60 and 90 days. And these aren't stamped in stone. And when it's presented, the candidate will say, this is what I believe my goals to be at this time. But certainly if, once I talk with my supervisor, these may very well change, but I think these are realistic goals. What that does is it communicates to the interviewer that the candidate knows they need to hit the ground running and add value quickly. Then the next section is why hire me? So it's kind of a sales summation about what the benefits are that they're going to bring to the job. And then the last section is some questions that the candidate would like to ask, because you're always in an interview, you're always asked, what questions, do you have any questions for us? So going in with a list of prepared questions is very helpful. So that's the presentation. And all the way through, it creates a conversation. Even like on the 60 and 90-day strategic action plan, there can be a conversation about how those goals will be achieved, what steps will be taken, how they may have achieved similar goals previously. So all this stuff becomes really a conversation.
So I'm curious during this conversation, but depending on who they are interviewing with, whether it's maybe the initial interview is HR, maybe there's a team interview, then ultimately the hiring manager or some order thereof. How will this presentation evolve for the candidate to make sure he or she is delivering and brings with them the right information and sharing it at the right time to the right audience?
Well, a lot of these things are, if you do a good reading of the job description, the presentation is very on target. And one of the things I've seen done is that a person will modify their presentation from one round of interview to the next as they start to learn more information. People typically will not use their presentation in a screening interview, like with someone from HR. What they'll do is they'll use that screening interview to get as much information as they can about the job, which they can then use to inform their presentation. I just had a candidate who went in for a job. She used her presentation in the first round. When she showed up for the second round, everybody she interviewed with had a copy of her presentation with notes on it. And that's not uncommon because, first of all, it's such a new and unique and different approach. Number one, it's impressive because it shows huge preparation. The other thing is that psychologically, if someone takes something like a presentation and makes notes on it, a couple of things are happening. One is that an auditory, and most of us are not auditory learners, that we don't learn by listening. Most of us learn by being visual and seeing things. And then there's a number of us that are kinesthetic learners that we learn by moving and like writing something. So the job interviews are typically just auditory, and the interview is only going to remember 50% of what the candidate tells them. It's only going to be the 50% that they kind of remember and that gets through their bias filters. So by having a presentation that is now auditory, is visual because you're seeing the words, and then oftentimes the interviewer actually writes on it. So they're getting this information through three different senses, which means it has a lot more impact. And they tend to remember the information more, and which makes it more persuasive.
Eric, can you talk a little bit about the experience or a few more examples of the experience that your clients are realizing from embracing these techniques that you've introduced them to via the active interviewing?
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's a couple of ones that really stands out. I had one candidate who's going for a pretty high-level position in telecommunications, and he brought his presentation with him to the first round. And the interviewer that he interviewed with said, this is really amazing. He said, the interviewer said, I've been trying to hire someone for months. And the problem is that each candidate has to go through 4 or 5 or 6 different rounds of interviewing. And invariably, somewhere through that 5 or 6 rounds, someone doesn't like the candidate, and that candidate gets knocked out. He said, but let's use this presentation. And what he did is he coached my client through into each interview and said, okay, you're going to interview with this person. Let's highlight this, talk about this, make sure you do this. You're going to talk to the next guy, change the presentation this way, add this, make sure that you emphasize this. And by using the presentation and the coaching, this candidate got through all the levels of interview and got hired. There was another candidate who was going for a job. He was a salesperson, and he was actually interviewing with kind of a competitor the company was working with, and been trying to set up this interview. It had been canceled a number of times, and finally they were able to set up the interview. But what had happened between the time that the candidate had started talking about this job and the time when the interview actually happened, there had been an internal candidate that had come up. And the interviewer, the hiring manager, didn't feel like he could cancel the interview again, but decided to go through it. So they sat down together. It was actually in the lobby of a hotel. And, it was like 15, 20 minutes into the interview, and it was kind of wrapping up. And the candidate said, I have a presentation I'd like to share with you. And he took his presentation out, and they went through the whole presentation, and they got to the last page of the presentation. And there was a question that the candidate had put on his presentation because he knew the industry pretty well. And it was a really vexing question for everybody. And the hiring manager said, we've been struggling with this. And he goes and he gets a napkin, and they're writing all sorts of ideas down, exchanging ideas back and forth. And the candidate didn't get the job, but the hiring manager went back to his boss and said, we need to hire this guy. And they actually created a job for him. Now, without the presentation, they would have spoken for like 15, 20 minutes. The hiring manager would have got up, gone off to dinner, and would have forgotten about the candidate. But the presentation really solidified things, made it concrete, and really changed the dynamics of what went on between the two of them.
So I'm curious. I mean, this is pretty amazing work. The work that is going into this model, how you are executing it with your candidates. Are you relying just on the books? I mean, you are an accomplished author. You've got, 101 successful networking strategies, 101 successful interviewing strategies. And in fact, active interviewing is the second edition of this model. Besides just writing these books and working with your own clients, how else are you getting this message out there? Because, I come from I'm a former IT guy. I've been coaching for a while now, a lot of career coaching, transition, career development. But this model is different than ones that I've heard before. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm chatting with you, Eric, I need to learn this. So how do we get this model? How do you get this model out to other coaches, out to other clients to begin to bring that into their toolbox?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. We actually have a website called Interview Best. And what Interview Best does is it takes people through 3 steps. The first step is that there is a preparation stage where people put together a briefing book. So there's a series of questions that a candidate answers about the industry, the company, and the job. And once they've gone through and they've answered those questions, they actually have a briefing book that they can study. Then the next step is we have a presentation builder. So we take people through step by step by step, putting together one of these presentations. And the way we do that is we offer expert libraries. So for example, for the first page, I mentioned that you have 4 personal brand terms. Well, we have hundreds of brand terms you can select from. So you can look through the list, choose the ones that you think best apply to you, and then you click on them and it puts in the presentation. There's also a library for additional areas of expertise. So broken down by industry, there's all sorts of suggestions. So for example, if you're in HR, you could be going for recruiting, but there's other areas of expertise, which might be compensation or there might be diversity. So you can look through and say, well, yeah, I know these things as well. And I'll put those on my presentation. You click on them, puts into the presentation. We have a section where we help you write success stories. There's source stories. What's the situation? What obstacles are you up against? What actions did you take? And what the results? We have another library for the strategic action plan. We suggest goals for the first 30 days and the first 60 days. We have a library for interview questions that you might want to ask. So we actually take people through the process, but we make suggestions. And then once they can certainly select any of these items, pop it into their presentation, and then they can edit them so that it's personal to them. And then the third stage is you come back to after the interview, we help you write a follow-through letter. And we do that by giving you sentence stems. I was particularly impressed by, I look forward to, I know you were concerned with, however, and you just finish those sentences and then it strings it together into a letter and then you can email that letter.
Oh, that is amazing. I definitely need to go and peruse the Interview Best, Derek. I think you have a new convert. Who says a 50, 60-something guy can't learn something new? So I have one question. I mean, we are in the midst of COVID-19. Pretty much everything we do these days is virtual. How has this model, the execution of this model for candidates, how is that evolving for them? Especially since, we're no longer going to hand a deck and put it on the table and be able to take notes. If I'm the hiring manager, or the team, the group interview, we're not going to be able to write notes in the moment. How am I going to use this material in the world of COVID-19 that we're in right now?
It's an interesting question because even before COVID, a number of our candidates who are actually international would interview virtually. So they would be interviewing via a Zoom-like, interface. So the way that people do it is they simply send the presentation to the interviewer. It could be like 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the interview and simply say, same thing, I put together this presentation. If we have time, I'd love to go through it with you. And then they just go through it. If the interviewer wants to print it out, they have it. But if not, you can certainly share screens and you can talk through the various items. So it works equally as well. again, because what happens is the whole dynamic changes. And the message is, as a candidate, I have things I want you to know about me. I'm going to share these things. I'm not going to wait until you ask me the right questions to elicit the information, which you may never do. The other thing is that unfortunately, the coaching community and authors have put way too much emphasis on answering interview questions for candidates. And there's dozens and dozens of books written on the top 100 most asked interview questions or the top 500 most asked interview questions and how to answer them. What I found is that there are literally thousands of possible interview questions. How can you prepare for them all? It's impossible. You can't. And people just have huge anxiety about not being able to answer interview questions. Well, this flips it on its head. This is, I'm not going to worry about what questions you're going to ask me. I'm going to give you the information I want you to know about. Again, it's just a typical sales scenario. You don't walk into a car dealership and the car salesman sits there behind their desk and says, "What questions do you have for me?" It's like, the car salesman has a process that he wants to take the customers through, certainly answering a lot of questions, but it's a process. And a lot of it has to do with giving information to the customer that they want the customer to know about the car they're selling. Same thing as a candidate. You got to be active. You can't be passive. You got to differentiate yourself. You need to present the information you want the interviewer to know.
Fantastic. Well, I have to say, I'm really intrigued by active interviewing and your process. So I'm looking forward to, even for myself, beyond my podcast and my own coaching practice and going out there and learning more. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast. And if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, and especially to go out and, learn about the active interviewing model, where are the best places for them to go?
Yeah, I think at this point, actually, the best place would be Interview Best. That would really take them through the process. The other place would be actually YouTube. I have a lot of videos at this point that communicate the ideas about active interviewing. And there's actually some lectures I've done at various universities out there. And then there's also videos that break down the active interviewing process into pieces. And that's just Eric Kramer on YouTube. And really, I think that's, to be informed, that would be the one best place. I also tweet as Interview Best. But again, a lot of those tweets have to do with active interviewing, and a person can really learn most. Well, actually, the most they can learn is from the book, obviously. But then after the book, they can go to YouTube.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely provide backlinks to the website Interview Best, to your YouTube channel, and I'll provide a link to Twitter and also to your author page on Amazon. And I know I'm going to go out and pick up a copy of Active Interviewing. And because I think I'm actually, we were chatting, I'm thinking, I actually have a couple clients right now that would benefit from this process. Because one in particular has limiting beliefs, and we're working on those. And I think this model would really help him get to where he wants to go. So this is perfect timing. So thank you, Eric.
You're very welcome. It's great. And the book really does address limiting beliefs too. So, because it's a cognitive psychology model as well. So that would help your client a lot.
Very good. Well, listen, folks, we've just been chatting with Eric Kramer. He's the author of Active Interviewing, Branding, Selling, and Presenting Yourself to Win Your Next Job. And Eric's been gracious enough to join us today to talk about the active interviewing model. And, if you're listening to this podcast and you're not intrigued at the onset, you definitely better be at the end, because I know I am. And so I would encourage you to go out, learn more about Eric and his work at interviewbest.com, as well as his YouTube channel, Eric Kramer, and on Twitter. We'll provide, again, the backlinks to those sites as well, and of course, to his author page on Amazon. All right, folks, that's it. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Take care of yourselves, take care of your family, practice social distancing, wear your mask, and listen, hopefully you will have gone out to vote, and 2020 and a new beginning is hopefully on our horizon. So take care of yourselves And also, folks, do visit us on successinsightpodcast.com. When you listen to our episode with Eric, give us your comments. We'd love to hear from you. You can also visit us on LinkedIn and Facebook, successinsightpodcast.com. We are also on YouTube, as well as the major podcast stations, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Pandora. We're just about everywhere. So again, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a fantastic day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.